John Brown was a radical abolitionist and a fierce warrior against slavery who became one of the most controversial figures in American history. John Brown, the militant opponent of slavery, was born in Torrington, Connecticut on May 9, 1800. He came from a deeply religious family. He had an intense, penetrating gaze that seemed to look into men's souls. Brown's business ventures were numerous but largely unsuccessful. He was raised in a strict Calvinist household where his father taught him that slavery was a sin against God. When he was 12 years old, young John witnessed the brutal beating of a slave boy, an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life and cement his hatred of the peculiar institution. Then in the 1830s and 1840s, Brown moved his growing family from place to place, attempting various business enterprises including tanning, land speculation, and sheep farming. John Brown was a father of 20 children by 2 wives, though many died in childhood. In 1837, when the abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob, Brown publicly declared his dedication to destroying slavery. Brown was not a gradualist who believed slavery would fade away through moral persuasion. He was a man of action who believed that slavery was so evil, so corrupting, so against God's law that it must be destroyed by any means necessary, including violence. In 1847, Brown met Frederick Douglass, the famous escaped slave and abolitionist speaker. Douglass was impressed by Brown's commitment but troubled by his willingness to use violence. Brown told Douglass that slavery was a state of war and that enslaved people had the right to fight for their freedom with weapons. Brown was not wealthy. He struggled throughout his life with poverty and debt. His business failures mounted. But he was a man possessed by a single vision, the destruction of slavery in America. In 1855, Brown followed 5 of his sons to the Kansas Territory. Kansas was bleeding. The territory had become a battleground between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, each side determined to control whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. Brown arrived in Kansas and immediately joined the Free State forces. He was 55 years old, but he had the energy and determination of a much younger man. The violence in Kansas escalated. Pro-slavery forces sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, burning buildings and destroying printing presses. Brown was enraged. He believed that God was calling him to take revenge, to strike terror into the hearts of slavery's defenders. On the night of May 24, 1856, John Brown led a small group including 4 of his sons to Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. Brown claimed he was carrying out God's judgment against those who supported slavery. The Pottawatomie massacre shocked the nation. Brown had crossed a line. He had committed murder in the name of abolition. Brown became a wanted man in Kansas, but he also became a symbol of militant resistance to slavery. Some abolitionists were horrified by his violence. Others saw him as a righteous warrior doing what was necessary to combat an evil system. Brown himself never expressed remorse for the killings at Pottawatomie. He believed he was an instrument of divine justice. After the massacre, Brown continued to fight in Kansas, engaging in guerrilla warfare against pro-slavery forces. He participated in several battles and skirmishes. His reputation grew. He was called a terrorist by his enemies and a freedom fighter by his supporters. In 1857, Brown left Kansas and began traveling through the North, meeting with prominent abolitionists and seeking financial support for a bold new plan. Brown had conceived an audacious scheme. He would attack slavery in the South itself. He would raid a federal arsenal, seize weapons, and arm enslaved people who would then rise up in rebellion. It was an incredibly ambitious and dangerous plan. Many of the abolitionists who met with Brown thought he was mad, but some were intrigued. A group of wealthy abolitionists, later known as the Secret Six, agreed to provide Brown with financial backing. They gave him money to purchase weapons and supplies. Brown spent months preparing for his raid. He rented a farm in Maryland, just across the Potomac River from Virginia. He recruited followers, young men who believed in his cause and were willing to risk their lives. Brown gathered a small army of 21 men, including 5 African Americans and 3 of his own sons. He drilled them and prepared them for the attack. Brown's target was Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a small town at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. Harper's Ferry was home to a federal armory and arsenal containing thousands of weapons. On the night of October 16, 1859, John Brown and his men moved into action. They cut telegraph wires and crossed the bridge into Harper's Ferry. They quickly seized the armory and the arsenal. They took hostages, including Colonel Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington. Brown's plan was to hold the armory, distribute weapons to enslaved people who would flock to his banner, and then move south through the mountains, liberating slaves and building an army as he went. But the plan immediately began to unravel. No enslaved people came to join Brown's rebellion. The local militia surrounded the armory. Brown and his men were trapped. Throughout the day on October 17, sporadic fighting erupted between Brown's men and the militia. Several of Brown's followers were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown refused to surrender. He believed that his cause was righteous and that God would deliver him. But God did not intervene. That evening, a company of United States Marines arrived, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later become the most famous general of the Confederacy. Lee's second-in-command was Lieutenant J.B. Stuart, another future Confederate hero. On the morning of October 18, Lee sent Stuart under a flag of truce to demand Brown surrender. Brown refused. Lee ordered the Marines to storm the armory. The assault lasted only a few minutes. The Marines battered down the door and rushed inside. Brown fought back, but he was quickly overpowered and wounded by a Marine officer's sword. 10 of Brown's men were killed in the raid, including 2 of his sons. 7 were captured, including Brown himself. 5 escaped. Brown had failed completely. His raid had lasted less than 36 hours. Not a single enslaved person had been freed. But the impact of his raid would reverberate through the nation and help push America toward civil war. Brown was taken into custody and charged with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and conspiring with slaves to rebel. He was still recovering from his wounds when he was put on trial just 1 week after the raid. The trial was held in Charlestown, Virginia. Brown lay on a cot in the courtroom, too injured to sit. The trial lasted only 4 days. Brown's lawyers tried to argue that he was insane, but Brown rejected that defense. He was not insane, he insisted. He knew exactly what he had done and why he had done it. He was proud of his actions. The evidence against Brown was overwhelming. He was found guilty on all counts. On November 2, 1859, Brown was sentenced to death by hanging. Between his sentencing and his execution, Brown became a powerful symbol. He wrote letters from his jail cell that were published in northern newspapers. He spoke eloquently about the evil of slavery and the righteousness of his cause. He compared himself to Christ, willing to die for the sins of others. Brown's words moved many Northerners who had previously been ambivalent about slavery. He was transforming himself from a failed terrorist into a martyr. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was led to the gallows in Charlestown. 1,500 troops surrounded the execution site, including a contingent commanded by a young Virginia Military Institute professor named Thomas Jackson, who would later be known as Stonewall Jackson. Among the soldiers was a Richmond militia member named John Wilkes Booth, who would later assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Brown walked calmly to the scaffold. He handed one of his guards a note that read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." At 11:15 in the morning, the trap door opened and John Brown dropped to his death. He was 59 years old. Church bells tolled across the north. Memorial services were held in many northern cities. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Henry David Thoreau compared Brown to Christ. But in the South, Brown was reviled as a murderer and a terrorist who had tried to incite a slave rebellion that would have led to the massacre of white Southerners. The South saw Brown's raid and the Northern sympathy for him as proof that the North wanted to destroy the Southern way of life. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry did not free a single slave, but it terrified the South and polarized the nation. Southerners began to believe that they could not remain in a union where many Northerners celebrated a man who had tried to start a slave insurrection. The raid accelerated the South's movement toward secession. Within 16 months of Brown's execution, the Civil War would begin. During the war, Union soldiers marched into battle singing John Brown's Body, a song that celebrated the old abolitionist. The song's melody would later be used for the battle hymn of the Republic. John Brown remains one of the most controversial figures in American history. Was he a terrorist or a freedom fighter? Was he insane or prophetic? Was he a murderer or a martyr? These questions have been debated for more than a century and a half. Brown himself would probably not have been troubled by the controversy. He believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. He believed that slavery was such a monstrous evil that violence against it was justified. He believed that God had chosen him to strike a blow against slavery, and he was willing to die for that belief. Brown was a man of contradictions. He was deeply religious, yet he committed murder. He spoke of love and justice, yet he showed no mercy to his victims at Pottawatomie Creek. He wanted to free enslaved people, yet his actions at Harper's Ferry put them in danger. He was a failure as a businessman, a failure as a military leader, and a failure in his raid on Harper's Ferry. But he succeeded in becoming a symbol of uncompromising opposition to slavery and a symbol of the violence that slavery would ultimately require to destroy it. Frederick Douglass, who had refused to join Brown at Harper's Ferry because he thought the plan was suicidal, later said of Brown that he had begun the war that ended American slavery. Douglass recognized that Brown's raid, though it failed militarily, succeeded in pushing the nation toward the confrontation that would finally end slavery. Brown had been willing to die for his beliefs, and his death had meaning. It inspired others. It forced Americans to confront the reality that slavery would not end peacefully, that it would require bloodshed and sacrifice. Brown's legacy is complicated. He used violence against innocent people. He was willing to sacrifice his own sons for his cause. He showed no remorse for the men he killed. Yet he also saw clearly what many of his contemporaries could not see, that slavery was an absolute evil that corrupted everything it touched, that compromise with slavery was itself a moral failure, and that slavery would only end through violent conflict. Brown was right about that. The Civil War would prove him right. More than 600,000 Americans would die in that war, a war that finally ended slavery in America. John Brown did not live to see the Civil War or the end of slavery. He died on the gallows in Charlestown, Virginia, convinced that he had done God's work. He died believing that his death would not be in vain, that it would inspire others to continue the fight against slavery. And he was right about that too. His execution made him a martyr for the abolitionist cause. His willingness to die for his beliefs inspired thousands of Northerners to support the war against the South when it came. Brown's story raises profound questions about the use of violence for moral causes. Can terrorism ever be justified? Can murder be righteous? Brown would have answered yes, that when confronting absolute evil, all means are justified. Most Americans today would reject that argument. We believe in the rule of law, in democratic processes, in non-violent resistance. But Brown lived in a time when the law protected slavery, when democratic processes had failed to end it, and when non-violent resistance seemed futile. In that context, Brown's violence, while still troubling, becomes more understandable if not more acceptable. The debate over John Brown reflects larger debates about American history. How do we remember and honor those who fought against injustice but used unjust means? How do we balance our admiration for their goals with our revulsion at their methods? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. John Brown forces us to confront these questions. He cannot be easily categorized as hero or villain. He was both and neither. He was a deeply flawed man who dedicated his life to a righteous cause. He was a murderer who died fighting slavery. He was a terrorist who became a martyr. In the end, John Brown's greatest legacy may be that he forced America to confront the reality of slavery and the price that would have to be paid to end it. He showed that slavery would not fade away gradually, that it would not be ended by compromise or negotiation. It would only be ended by blood, by sacrifice, by war. Brown was willing to shed that blood, to make that sacrifice. He paid with his life and with the lives of his sons. And within 2 years of his death, the entire nation would pay that price in the Civil War. John Brown was buried in North Elba, New York, on his farm in the Adirondack Mountains. His grave became a pilgrimage site for abolitionists and later for civil rights activists. His body lies moldering in the grave, as the song says, but his soul goes marching on. That soul, that uncompromising spirit of resistance to injustice, continues to inspire and trouble Americans. We remember John Brown not because he was successful but because he was willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. We remember him because he saw the truth about slavery when many others did not. And we remember him because his story, with all its complexity and contradiction, is part of the American story, a story of struggle between justice and injustice, between freedom and oppression, between the ideals we profess and the reality we create. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker preacher and a pioneering reformer who became one of the most influential voices for justice in 19th-century America. Lucretia Mott, a tireless advocate for abolition and women's rights, was born Lucretia Coffin on January 3, 1793, on the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts. She came from a family of Quakers, a religious community known for their belief in equality and social justice. She had a quiet strength and moral conviction that would define her entire life. Mott's upbringing was shaped by the values of the Society of Friends, where women were permitted to speak in religious meetings and hold positions of spiritual authority. She was educated at Quaker schools where she developed her intellectual abilities and her commitment to equality. Then in 1809, at the age of 16, she met James Mott, a fellow teacher at the Nine Partners Quaker boarding school in New York. The two young educators fell in love and married in 1811. Lucretia Mott was a woman of principle who believed deeply in living according to her faith and her conscience. She had 6 children and raised them while simultaneously developing her voice as a minister and reformer. In 1821, when she was just 28 years old, Lucretia Mott became a recognized Quaker minister. She began to preach at Quaker meetings and her reputation as a powerful speaker grew throughout the region. Mott spoke with clarity and conviction about the moral issues of her day. In the 1820s and 1830s, she became increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement. The institution of slavery was the great moral crisis of 19th-century America, and Mott saw it as fundamentally incompatible with Christian values and human dignity. She joined the American Anti-Slavery Society and became one of its most effective advocates. Mott was not content to simply speak against slavery. She lived her principles, refusing to use cotton cloth or cane sugar or any products produced by slave labor. This commitment to what she called free produce was a form of economic protest against the slave system. In December 1833, Lucretia Mott helped found the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. This organization brought together women of different races and backgrounds in the common cause of abolition. At a time when women had few political rights and were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, Mott and her fellow activists were asserting their right to participate in the great moral debates of their time. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society organized petition drives, held public meetings, and raised funds for the abolitionist cause. Mott became a prominent figure in the movement, speaking at gatherings throughout the North. She faced considerable opposition and even violence. In 1838, when abolitionists gathered at Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia for the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, an angry mob attacked the building and burned it to the ground. Mott had been one of the main speakers at the convention. She refused to be intimidated by the violence and continued her work with even greater determination. Lucretia Mott was a brilliant orator who could move audiences with her words. She spoke without notes, drawing on her deep knowledge of scripture and her passionate commitment to justice. Her speeches combined religious conviction with practical arguments about human rights and social reform. She traveled extensively, speaking in churches, meeting halls, and private homes. Wherever she went, she challenged people to examine their consciences and to act against the evil of slavery. Mott believed that moral persuasion was the key to social change. She argued that if people truly understood the brutality and injustice of slavery, they would be compelled to oppose it. She described the suffering of enslaved people in vivid terms, making the abstract reality of slavery concrete and personal for her audiences. In June 1840, Lucretia Mott traveled to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. She was one of several women delegates from American abolitionist societies. When they arrived in London, however, the convention organizers refused to seat the women delegates. After heated debate, the male delegates voted to exclude women from full participation in the convention. The women were permitted to sit in a separate section behind a curtain where they could observe but not speak. Mott and the other women were outraged by this treatment. Among those who sat with Mott behind the curtain was a young woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two women formed a friendship that would change the course of American history. During their time in London, Mott and Stanton discussed the need for a movement to address the rights of women. They talked about organizing a convention focused specifically on women's rights. It would take 8 years for that vision to become reality. Lucretia Mott returned to America and continued her work for abolition and social reform. She and her husband James were active in the Underground Railroad, providing shelter and assistance to freedom seekers escaping from slavery. Their home in Philadelphia became a station on the network that helped thousands of enslaved people reach freedom in the North and in Canada. Mott worked closely with other abolitionists, both black and white, including Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth. She believed in the importance of interracial cooperation in the fight against slavery. At a time when American society was deeply segregated, Mott insisted on the full equality and humanity of all people regardless of race. In July 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton finally organized the convention they had discussed in London 8 years earlier. The Seneca Falls Convention was held in upstate New York and brought together approximately 300 people to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Mott was one of the primary organizers and speakers at the convention. The gathering produced the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled on the Declaration of Independence that outlined the ways in which women were denied equality in American society. The Declaration stated that all men and women are created equal and listed 18 grievances against the treatment of women. These included the denial of the right to vote, the lack of property rights for married women, limited educational and employment opportunities, and the exclusion of women from most professions and positions of authority. The Seneca Falls Convention marked the beginning of the organized women's rights movement in America. Lucretia Mott was 55 years old and already a veteran reformer with decades of experience in public advocacy. She brought to the women's rights movement the same moral conviction and strategic thinking that had made her an effective abolitionist. Mott understood that the struggle for women's rights was connected to the struggle for abolition. Both movements were based on the fundamental principle that all human beings possess equal rights and dignity. She argued that the same arguments used to justify slavery, that certain groups of people were naturally inferior and suited only for subordinate roles, were also used to justify the subordination of women. Following the Seneca Falls Convention, Lucretia Mott continued to speak and organize for both abolition and women's rights. She helped establish the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, an organization dedicated to securing equal rights for all citizens regardless of race or sex. Mott served as president of the organization and worked to build bridges between the women's rights movement and the movement for racial justice. She believed that these causes were inseparable and that true equality required addressing both forms of oppression simultaneously. However, the relationship between the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement became strained in the years following the Civil War. When the 15th Amendment was proposed to grant voting rights to black men but not to women, the women's rights movement split over whether to support the amendment. Lucretia Mott was deeply troubled by this division. She supported the 15th Amendment even though it did not include women, believing that it was an important step toward racial justice that should not be opposed. She argued for patience and continued advocacy for women's suffrage while supporting the immediate extension of voting rights to black men. This position put her at odds with some of her longtime allies in the women's rights movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. Mott tried to maintain unity and to keep the focus on the broader goals of equality and justice. She urged her fellow reformers not to let disagreement over strategy destroy the movements they had built together over decades of work. Throughout her long career, Lucretia Mott remained committed to nonviolence and moral persuasion as the tools of social change. She was a pacifist who opposed all forms of violence, including war and violent resistance to oppression. During the Civil War, she supported the Union cause and the goal of ending slavery, but she grieved over the terrible loss of life and hoped for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. After the war ended in 1865, Mott focused her efforts on reconciliation and on ensuring that the promises of freedom and equality would be fulfilled for the formerly enslaved people. She continued to speak out against racial discrimination and to advocate for full civil rights for African Americans. Lucretia Mott was also a champion of other reform causes. She supported temperance, believing that alcohol abuse contributed to poverty and domestic violence. She advocated for prison reform and more humane treatment of criminals. She called for improvements in education and for greater access to learning for all people. She supported the peace movement and worked for international cooperation and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Mott saw all of these causes as connected by common principles of human dignity, compassion, and justice. She believed that society could be transformed through moral awakening and that individuals had a responsibility to work for the common good. In her personal life, Lucretia Mott was known for her warmth, her wit, and her generous hospitality. Her home was a gathering place for reformers, intellectuals, and seekers of justice from around the world. She and James Mott had a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. James supported his wife's public work and often traveled with her to conventions and speaking engagements. He managed their household and business affairs so that Lucretia could dedicate her time to advocacy and ministry. Their marriage was a model of equality and cooperation at a time when married women had few legal rights and were expected to be subordinate to their husbands. Lucretia Mott continued her work well into her 70s and 80s. She remained active in the women's rights movement and attended conventions and meetings whenever her health permitted. In 1878, at the age of 85, she attended the 30th anniversary celebration of the Seneca Falls Convention. She spoke to the gathering about the progress that had been made and the work that still remained to be done. Mott acknowledged that the goals of the women's rights movement had not been fully achieved, but she expressed confidence that future generations would continue the struggle and eventually secure full equality for women. She encouraged younger activists to persevere and to maintain their commitment to justice even in the face of setbacks and opposition. On November 11, 1880, Lucretia Mott died at her home near Philadelphia. She was 87 years old and had devoted more than 60 years of her life to the causes of abolition, women's rights, and social reform. Her death was mourned by reformers across the country and around the world. Memorial services were held in Philadelphia and other cities, and speakers paid tribute to her courage, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader and orator, spoke at her memorial service and praised her as one of the most important reformers of the 19th century. He recalled her kindness to him when he was a young man just beginning his work in the abolitionist movement and her steadfast support for racial equality throughout her life. Lucretia Mott left behind a legacy that extended far beyond her own lifetime. She helped to launch the organized women's rights movement in America and inspired generations of activists who continued the fight for equality. The Seneca Falls Convention that she helped organize is recognized as a pivotal moment in American history, the beginning of a movement that would eventually secure voting rights and legal equality for women. Mott's work for abolition contributed to the end of slavery and to the expansion of civil rights for African Americans. Her advocacy for peace, education, and social justice influenced countless other reform movements. What made Lucretia Mott such an effective reformer was her ability to combine moral conviction with practical strategy. She was deeply religious and saw her activism as an expression of her faith, but she also understood how to organize, how to build coalitions, and how to communicate effectively with diverse audiences. She was willing to work with people who disagreed with her on some issues if they shared common goals on others. She built bridges across lines of race, religion, and ideology. Mott was also remarkable for her consistency. She lived according to the principles she preached, refusing to compromise her values even when it would have been easier or more profitable to do so. Her refusal to use products made by slave labor was just one example of her commitment to making her daily life consistent with her beliefs. Lucretia Mott understood that social change is a long process that requires patience, persistence, and courage. She knew that she would not live to see all of her goals achieved, but she believed that each generation had a responsibility to advance the cause of justice as far as it could. She encouraged her fellow reformers to think in terms of decades and generations rather than months and years. She reminded them that the arc of history bends toward justice, but only through the sustained efforts of people committed to making it so. Mott was willing to endure criticism, opposition, and even violence because she believed that the causes she served were more important than her own comfort or safety. In the history of American reform movements, Lucretia Mott stands as one of the most important and influential figures. She was a pioneer who helped to create new possibilities for women's participation in public life. She was a moral leader who called America to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality. She was a bridge builder who worked to unite different movements and different communities in common cause. She was a woman of faith who saw the divine image in every human being and who dedicated her life to defending the dignity and rights of all people. Lucretia Mott's life reminds us that ordinary individuals can make extraordinary contributions to social progress through courage, conviction, and sustained commitment to justice. Susan B. Anthony was a pioneering voice for women's rights who dedicated her entire life to the cause of equality. Susan B. Anthony, one of America's most influential social reformers, was born in Adams, Massachusetts on February 15, 1820. She came from a Quaker family with strong moral convictions. Anthony had a determined and unwavering character. Her family's commitment to social justice was profound. She was educated in her father's school until the age of 17 when she began teaching to help support her family. Then in 1839, the family moved to a farm near Rochester, New York, and the young Susan B. Anthony began her journey into activism, attending meetings and gatherings that would shape her future. Susan B. Anthony never married, choosing instead to devote herself entirely to the cause of social reform. In 1848, when the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, Anthony was teaching and had not yet joined the movement. She worked as a teacher and headmistress, experiencing firsthand the discrimination women faced in wages and opportunities. She was paid a fraction of what male teachers earned for the same work, and this inequality planted the seeds of her activism. In 1851, Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this meeting would change the course of American history. The two women formed a partnership that would last 50 years. Susan B. Anthony was not initially focused solely on women's suffrage. She began her activism in the temperance movement. Anthony believed that alcohol was destroying families and that women needed legal protections against drunken husbands. In 1852, she was denied the right to speak at a temperance convention because she was a woman. Anthony was outraged by this discrimination and realized that women would never have real power to reform society without the right to vote. She began to see suffrage as the key to all other reforms. Anthony was a tireless organizer who traveled constantly across the country. She gave speeches in small towns and large cities, often facing hostile crowds. Anthony endured ridicule, threats, and even physical violence for her beliefs. People threw rotten eggs at her, shouted insults, and tried to drown out her words. But Anthony never wavered in her commitment to the cause. She believed deeply that women deserved the same rights and opportunities as men. In 1856, Anthony became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. She recognized the connection between the oppression of enslaved people and the oppression of women. Anthony worked alongside Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists to end slavery. During the Civil War, Anthony and Stanton organized the Women's Loyal National League, which collected nearly 400,000 signatures on petitions to abolish slavery. This was the largest petition drive in American history up to that time. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Anthony expected that women would be granted the right to vote along with formerly enslaved men. She was devastated when the 14th and 15th Amendments extended citizenship and voting rights to black men but excluded all women. Anthony felt betrayed by her former allies in the abolitionist movement. Some of her statements during this period reflected the racial prejudices of her time, and she sometimes argued that educated white women deserved the vote more than uneducated black men. This remains a troubling aspect of her legacy. In 1868, Anthony and Stanton began publishing a weekly newspaper called The Revolution. The paper's motto was "Men, their rights and nothing more, women, their rights and nothing less." The Revolution covered women's suffrage, equal pay, labor organizing, and other progressive causes. The newspaper was bold and controversial, advocating for divorce reform and criticizing religious institutions that oppressed women. The Revolution lost money and Anthony went into debt to keep it running. She spent years lecturing to pay off those debts, refusing to declare bankruptcy on principle. Susan B. Anthony believed in direct action and civil disobedience. On November 5, 1872, Anthony did something radical and illegal. She walked into a barbershop in Rochester, New York, that was being used as a polling place, and she registered to vote. The election inspectors were confused and uncertain, but Anthony insisted on her right as a citizen. She argued that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, gave women the constitutional right to vote. On Election Day, November 18, 1872, Susan B. Anthony cast her ballot for Ulysses S. Grant for president. 2 weeks later, a U.S. Marshal arrived at Anthony's home to arrest her. She was charged with voting illegally. Anthony insisted that the marshal handcuff her like a common criminal, wanting to highlight the injustice. She was released on bail, which she opposed paying, but her lawyer paid it without her consent. Anthony used her arrest as a platform, giving speeches across the country titled "Is It a Crime for a Citizen of the United States to Vote?" The trial of Susan B. Anthony took place in June 1873 in Canandaigua, New York. The trial was a travesty of justice from the beginning. The judge, Ward Hunt, was openly hostile to Anthony's cause. He had written his decision before the trial even began. When Anthony's lawyer tried to have her testify, the judge ruled that as a woman, she was not competent to testify in her own defense. At the end of the trial, Judge Hunt directed the all-male jury to find Anthony guilty without deliberation. He pulled out a prepared statement and read the guilty verdict himself. Before sentencing, the judge asked Anthony if she had anything to say. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Anthony delivered a powerful speech that became famous throughout the nation. She declared that the court had trampled on her citizens' rights, that she had been denied a trial by a jury of her peers, and that the government was not a democracy but an odious aristocracy. She spoke with passion and fury, refusing to be silenced. The judge repeatedly ordered her to sit down and be quiet, but Anthony continued speaking. Finally, the judge sentenced her to pay a fine of $100. Anthony responded, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." And she never did. The government never attempted to collect the fine, likely because forcing payment would have given Anthony grounds for an appeal to the Supreme Court. Susan B. Anthony understood that changing society required changing laws, and changing laws required political organization. In 1869, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Woman Suffrage Association. The organization focused exclusively on securing the vote for women through a constitutional amendment. Anthony served as the organization's vice president and traveling organizer. She crisscrossed the country, organizing local suffrage societies, raising money, and recruiting new activists. Anthony traveled by train, stagecoach, and wagon, enduring uncomfortable accommodations and difficult conditions. She often stayed in supporters' homes, sleeping on couches and working late into the night writing letters and planning strategy. In 1890, the National Woman Suffrage Association merged with a rival organization to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Anthony served as president from 1892 to 1900. Under her leadership, the organization grew stronger and more focused. Anthony mentored a new generation of suffrage leaders, including Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. She understood that the fight for women's suffrage would outlast her lifetime, and she worked to build an organization that would continue after she was gone. Anthony also worked for other reforms beyond suffrage. She advocated for women's property rights, equal pay for equal work, and educational opportunities for women. She supported the admission of women to universities and professional schools. Anthony believed that women needed economic independence to be truly free. She encouraged women to learn trades and enter professions traditionally reserved for men. Anthony herself was financially independent, supporting herself through lecturing and writing. In 1888, Anthony helped organize the International Council of Women in Washington, D.C. Delegates from 53 women's organizations and 9 countries attended. The conference demonstrated that the movement for women's rights was global. Anthony traveled to Europe several times, meeting with suffragists and reformers from other nations. She understood that the struggle for equality was universal and that women around the world faced similar obstacles. Susan B. Anthony was a complex person with contradictions in her character and beliefs. She was warm and generous with friends but could be demanding and inflexible about the cause. She had a sharp sense of humor and enjoyed social gatherings, but she also worked herself to exhaustion. Anthony never sought personal glory or wealth. She lived modestly, often wearing the same black dress to speaking engagements. Any money she earned from lectures went to support the suffrage movement. Anthony sacrificed marriage and children for her work, though she maintained close friendships and was devoted to her family. Her relationship with Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the most important partnership of her life. Stanton was the writer and philosopher, while Anthony was the organizer and strategist. Stanton would write speeches and Anthony would deliver them. They complemented each other perfectly. Stanton once said that she forged the thunderbolts and Anthony fired them. The two women were inseparable for decades, though they sometimes disagreed on tactics and priorities. Their friendship endured until Stanton's death in 1902. By the turn of the 20th century, Susan B. Anthony had become a revered figure in American life. Younger activists called her Aunt Susan with affection and respect. Newspapers that had once mocked her now praised her dedication and character. Presidents and politicians sought her endorsement. But Anthony remained focused on the goal that had eluded her for 50 years, a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. In 1900, at the age of 80, Anthony retired as president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She continued to work for the cause, attending conventions and giving speeches. Her health began to decline, but her spirit remained strong. Anthony knew she would not live to see women vote, but she never lost faith that victory would come. In February 1906, Anthony attended her last suffrage convention in Baltimore. She was 86 years old and weak from illness. She gave a short speech to the delegates, her voice frail but determined. Her final public words were, "Failure is impossible." Those words became the rallying cry for the suffrage movement. 1 month later, on March 13, 1906, Susan B. Anthony died of heart failure and pneumonia at her home in Rochester, New York. Anthony did not live to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, 14 years after her death. The amendment, which finally granted women the right to vote, became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in honor of her lifelong work. Her face appeared on the dollar coin in 1979, making her the first woman to be honored on U.S. currency. Today, her home in Rochester is a National Historic Landmark and museum dedicated to her memory and the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony's legacy extends far beyond the right to vote. She helped transform American society by challenging the fundamental assumption that women were inferior to men. Anthony argued that women were full human beings deserving of equal rights, equal opportunities, and equal respect. This was a radical idea in the 19th century, and it remains the foundation of modern feminism. Anthony understood that legal equality was necessary but not sufficient. She believed that women needed to change their own consciousness to see themselves as powerful and capable. The suffrage movement that Anthony led was not perfect. It sometimes excluded women of color and failed to address the intersection of racism and sexism. Working-class women and immigrant women often felt unwelcome in suffrage organizations dominated by educated, middle-class white women. Anthony herself made statements that reflected the prejudices of her era. These failures and limitations must be acknowledged as part of her complex legacy. But Antony's fundamental message remains powerful and relevant. She insisted that democracy cannot exist when half the population is denied basic rights. She demonstrated that ordinary people, through organization and persistence, can change unjust laws. She showed that social progress requires sacrifice and that no single generation will complete the work of justice. Antony understood that movements succeed when they build institutions, develop leaders, and maintain focus over decades. Susan B. Anthony never married, never had children, and never held political office. She devoted her entire adult life to a cause that seemed hopeless to many of her contemporaries. She endured mockery, arrest, and exhaustion. She died without seeing her goal achieved. Yet her life was not a failure. Antony helped build a movement that changed America and inspired similar movements around the world. She proved that one person, through dedication and courage, can make history. Antony's methods of activism remain relevant today. She understood the power of grassroots organizing, of building coalitions, of using the media to spread her message. She knew that changing minds required patience and repetition. Antony gave the same speech hundreds of times in towns across America, knowing that each audience was hearing these ideas for the first time. She wrote thousands of letters, organized countless meetings, and mentored dozens of younger activists. This unglamorous work of movement building was her true genius. Susan B. Anthony also understood the importance of symbols and dramatic action. Her illegal vote in 1872 and subsequent trial brought national attention to the suffrage cause. The trial was a defeat in legal terms, but a victory in terms of publicity and moral authority. Antony knew how to turn setbacks into opportunities. When opponents attacked her, she used their attacks to demonstrate the injustice of denying women political rights. Antony's relationship with power was complex. She sought political influence but never political office. She lobbied presidents and members of Congress, but she remained an outsider. This position gave her moral authority and freedom to speak truth to power. Antony was not constrained by party loyalty or political calculation. She could say what needed to be said, even when it was unpopular or inconvenient. The woman suffrage movement that Antony led was part of a broader transformation of American society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The progressive era saw reforms in labor conditions, food safety, education, and political participation. Women activists were at the forefront of many of these reforms. Antony understood that women's suffrage would accelerate social progress by giving women political power to advocate for change. Susan B. Anthony's life spanned a remarkable period in American history. She was born when slavery was legal and women had almost no legal rights. She lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction, industrialization, and the rise of America as a world power. She witnessed the expansion of democracy to include formerly enslaved men, though not yet women. Antony saw tremendous change in her lifetime, and she helped create much of that change. Today, Susan B. Anthony is remembered as one of the most important figures in American history. Schools, streets, and organizations bear her name. Her birthday is celebrated as a day to honor women's equality. But Antony would not want to be remembered as a saint or a symbol. She was a real person who made mistakes, held some problematic views, and sometimes alienated potential allies. She was also brave, principled, and utterly committed to justice. The story of Susan B. Anthony reminds us that social change is possible but never easy. It requires vision, organization, persistence, and sacrifice. It requires building movements that can sustain themselves across generations. Antony understood that she was part of a long struggle that began before her birth and would continue after her death. She accepted her role in that struggle with grace and determination. Susan B. Anthony's most important legacy may be her example of how to live a meaningful life. She chose a difficult path and never wavered from it. She found purpose in working for something larger than herself. She built deep friendships and found joy in the struggle. Antony proved that a life of activism and commitment can be fulfilling, even when success seems distant. She showed that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they dedicate themselves to a just cause. In the end, Susan B. Anthony was right. Failure was impossible. The cause to which she devoted her life ultimately triumphed. Women won the right to vote, and that victory opened doors to countless other opportunities and rights. The work is not finished. Women still face discrimination and inequality in many areas of life. But the foundation that Anthony helped build remains strong. Her words and example continue to inspire new generations of activists fighting for equality and justice. Susan B. Anthony was, even in death, a unifying force for progress and human dignity. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a brilliant orator and tireless reformer who became the mother of the women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of America's most influential suffragists, was born in Johnstown, New York on November 12, 1815. She came from a prominent family. She had a sharp intellect and commanding presence. Stanton's family connections were substantial. She was educated in ways unusual for girls of her era, attending Johnstown Academy until the age of 16 when she continued her studies at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary, one of the first institutions to offer advanced education to women. Then in 1826, her brother Eleazar died, and the young Elizabeth witnessed her father's overwhelming grief at losing his only son. Elizabeth Cady tried desperately to console her father by excelling in traditionally male pursuits like Greek and horseback riding, but Judge Daniel Cady reportedly told her he wished she had been born a boy. Elizabeth Cady Stanton grew up in a household where she observed inequality firsthand. Her father was a judge and she spent time in his law office, listening to women plead for help with legal problems they could not solve because married women had no rights to property, earnings, or even their own children. In 1839, Elizabeth met Henry Brewster Stanton, an abolitionist agent and speaker. Henry was passionate about ending slavery. Within months they fell in love, and despite her family's reservations about Henry's financial prospects and radical politics, they married in 1840. Elizabeth insisted that the word "obey" be removed from their wedding ceremony, a radical act that signaled her lifelong resistance to women's subordination. Their honeymoon was a trip to London for the World Anti-Slavery Convention. Elizabeth accompanied Henry expecting to participate in the great debates about human freedom, but when they arrived, the convention organizers refused to seat the female delegates. The women were forced to sit behind a curtain in a segregated gallery, allowed to observe but not to speak. Elizabeth sat with Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister and abolitionist who was among those excluded. The two women were outraged by this treatment. They spent hours discussing the parallels between the oppression of enslaved people and the oppression of women. That experience planted the seeds for what would become the women's rights movement in America. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not a quiet, patient reformer content to wait for gradual change. She was a revolutionary thinker who demanded immediate and complete equality for women in every sphere of life. After returning from London, Elizabeth and Henry settled first in Boston, then in the small town of Seneca Falls, New York. Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children between 1842 and 1859. She was isolated in Seneca Falls, far from the intellectual stimulation she craved, overwhelmed by domestic duties and childcare. The contrast between her husband's freedom to travel and speak and her own confinement to the domestic sphere radicalized her further. She experienced firsthand the limitations placed on women, even educated, privileged women like herself. In July 1848, Elizabeth reconnected with Lucretia Mott, and together with a small group of women, they organized the first women's rights convention in American history. The Seneca Falls Convention was held on July 19 and 20, 1848, in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. Elizabeth drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled deliberately on the Declaration of Independence. She wrote that all men and women are created equal, and she listed 18 grievances against men's tyranny over women, just as the founders had listed grievances against King George. The Declaration demanded rights for women in education, employment, property, and religion. The most controversial demand in the Declaration of Sentiments was the call for women's suffrage, the right to vote. Even many supporters of women's rights thought this demand was too radical, too extreme, too far ahead of public opinion. Lucretia Mott warned Elizabeth that including suffrage would make them look ridiculous. But Elizabeth insisted. She argued that the vote was essential because without political power, women would always be dependent on men's goodwill for any rights they might gain. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former slave who attended the convention, stood up and supported the suffrage resolution. With his help, it passed, but only narrowly. The Seneca Falls Convention launched the organized women's rights movement in America. Elizabeth Cady Stanton became its leading philosopher and most eloquent voice. She wrote speeches, articles, and letters arguing for women's equality with a clarity and force that shocked and persuaded her audiences. She challenged not just laws but the fundamental assumptions about women's nature and proper role. She argued that women were not naturally inferior to men, not naturally suited only for domestic life, not naturally more moral or pure or delicate. She insisted that women were human beings who deserved the same rights and opportunities as men. In 1851, Elizabeth met Susan B. Anthony, a meeting that would change both their lives and the course of American history. Susan was a temperance activist who had experienced discrimination when she tried to speak at a temperance meeting and was told that women should listen and learn while men spoke and acted. Elizabeth and Susan formed a partnership that would last 50 years. They complemented each other perfectly. Elizabeth was the thinker and writer, brilliant at articulating ideas and crafting arguments. Susan was the organizer and strategist, tireless at building networks and planning campaigns. Elizabeth often said that she forged the thunderbolts and Susan fired them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a radical on many fronts beyond suffrage. She advocated for married women's property rights, arguing that wives should be able to own property, control their own earnings, and enter into contracts. She fought for women's right to divorce abusive or drunken husbands at a time when divorce was scandalous and nearly impossible to obtain. She demanded that women have access to higher education and professional careers. She called for dress reform, arguing that the corsets and heavy skirts women were forced to wear were instruments of oppression that restricted their movement and damaged their health. She even wore the bloomer costume for a time, a radical outfit featuring loose trousers under a short skirt, though she eventually abandoned it because the ridicule it provoked distracted from her message. The 1850s were years of intense activism for Elizabeth. She wrote constantly, producing speeches and articles for the women's rights movement. She spoke at conventions across New York State and beyond, though her domestic responsibilities often kept her home while Susan traveled and delivered the speeches Elizabeth had written. She lobbied the New York State legislature, and in 1854 she delivered a powerful address to the legislators arguing for women's rights. She told them that women were taxed without representation, governed without consent, and tried without a jury of their peers. She demanded that they reform the laws that treated married women as legal nonentities. The women's rights movement gained momentum in the 1850s, but it was interrupted by the Civil War. When the war began in 1861, Elizabeth and Susan suspended their women's rights work to support the Union cause and the abolition of slavery. They organized the Women's Loyal National League, which collected nearly 400,000 signatures on petitions calling for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. Elizabeth believed that the war and emancipation would create an opportunity to expand rights for everyone, including women. She expected that when the war ended, the nation would embrace universal suffrage, votes for both freed slaves and women. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton was bitterly disappointed by what happened after the war. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time, specifying that states would lose representation if they denied the vote to male citizens. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but it said nothing about sex. Elizabeth and Susan were outraged. Their former allies in the abolitionist movement told them it was the Negro's hour, that women would have to wait. Frederick Douglass, who had supported women's suffrage at Seneca Falls, now argued that black men's need for the vote was more urgent than women's. Elizabeth refused to wait. She refused to subordinate women's rights to any other cause. She opposed the 15th Amendment because it did not include women, a position that cost her many friendships and created a lasting split in the reform community. Some of her rhetoric during this period was racist and elitist. She argued that educated white women should not be subordinate to ignorant black men or immigrant men. She appealed to prejudice to make her case, suggesting that women's votes would counterbalance the votes of undesirable men. These arguments were strategic but also revealed the limitations of her vision. Elizabeth Cady Stanton fought for women's rights, but she did not always fight for all women equally. In 1869, Elizabeth and Susan founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, which focused exclusively on women's rights and demanded a federal constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. A rival organization, the American Woman Suffrage Association, was formed by Lucy Stone and others who had supported the 15th Amendment and who believed in working state by state for suffrage rather than pursuing a federal amendment. The split weakened the movement for 20 years until the two organizations merged in 1890. Elizabeth Cady Stanton continued to push boundaries throughout the 1870s and 1880s. She went on speaking tours across the country, traveling to California and back by train, delivering lectures on women's rights, marriage, divorce, and social reform. She was a compelling speaker with a gift for humor and storytelling. Audiences came to hear her even when they disagreed with her. She had a way of making radical ideas seem reasonable, of making people question assumptions they had never thought to examine. She spoke about the need for women to develop their individual talents, to be more than wives and mothers, to claim their full humanity. In the 1880s, Elizabeth worked with Susan and Matilda Jocelyn Gage on the history of women's suffrage, a massive documentary history of the movement. The project took years and produced thousands of pages recording speeches, conventions, and campaigns. Elizabeth wanted to ensure that the work of the women's rights pioneers would not be forgotten, that future generations would know what had been sacrificed and accomplished. She wrote much of the narrative herself, shaping the story of the movement and her own central role in it. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton's most controversial work came late in her life. In the 1890s, she began work on the Woman's Bible, a commentary on the passages of the Bible that mentioned women. Elizabeth believed that religion was the greatest obstacle to women's equality. She argued that as long as people believed that God had ordained women's subordination, that the Bible commanded wives to obey their husbands and women to keep silent in churches, the fight for women's rights would be hobbled. She wanted to challenge the religious arguments against women's equality by offering feminist interpretations of Scripture. The Woman's Bible was published in two parts in 1895 and 1898. Elizabeth wrote many of the commentaries herself, analyzing biblical passages and arguing that they had been mistranslated and misinterpreted by men to justify male dominance. She questioned the divine inspiration of Scripture, suggesting that the Bible was a human document that reflected the prejudices of its authors. She used wit and sarcasm to puncture the authority of biblical texts that demeaned women. The book was a bestseller, but it was also deeply controversial. Religious leaders denounced it. Many suffragists distanced themselves from it, fearing it would hurt the cause by alienating religious supporters. In 1896, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which Elizabeth had served as president from 1890 to 1892, passed a resolution disavowing any connection with the Woman's Bible. Susan B. Anthony tried to prevent the vote, arguing that the organization should not censure Elizabeth's personal views, but she was overruled. Elizabeth was hurt by the repudiation but not silenced. She continued to argue that women needed to free themselves from religious dogma as well as legal restrictions. She believed that true freedom required intellectual and spiritual independence, not just the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton spent her final years writing and reflecting. She published her autobiography, 80 Years and More, in 1898, a lively and engaging account of her life and work. She continued to write articles on women's rights, education, and social reform. Her eyesight was failing and she was increasingly confined to her home in New York City, but her mind remained sharp. She corresponded with friends and allies around the world. She followed the progress of the suffrage movement, frustrated that the vote had still not been won but confident that it eventually would be. Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived long enough to see significant changes in women's status. By the time of her death, women had won the right to attend colleges and universities, to enter professions, to control their own property and earnings in most states. Women were organizing, speaking, writing, and leading reform movements. The suffrage movement had become a mass movement with organizations in every state. But women still could not vote in national elections. Elizabeth would not live to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920, 18 years after her death. On October 26, 1902, Elizabeth Cady Stanton died at her home in New York City. She was 86 years old. She died surrounded by family, her mind active until nearly the end. When she died, she left behind a legacy of radical thought and tireless activism. She had challenged every assumption about women's proper place. She had demanded equality in law, in education, in marriage, in politics, and in religion. She had inspired generations of women to claim their rights and to refuse to accept subordination. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a complex figure, brilliant and flawed, visionary and limited by her own privileges and prejudices. She fought passionately for women's rights but sometimes failed to recognize how race and class shaped women's experiences differently. She was willing to use racist and elitist arguments when she thought they would advance the cause of suffrage. She alienated potential allies with her attacks on religion and her refusal to compromise on principle. But she was also fearless, intellectually honest, and uncompromising in her demand for full equality. Stanton understood that winning the vote was important but not sufficient. She believed that women needed to transform their consciousness, to stop accepting the idea that they were inferior or that their only purpose was to serve men and children. She wanted women to develop their talents, to think for themselves, to claim authority over their own lives. She argued that women's emancipation required not just legal and political changes but a revolution in ideas, in culture, in the most intimate relationships between men and women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's partnership with Susan B. Anthony was one of the most important collaborations in American history. Together they built a movement that would eventually win the vote and transform American society. Elizabeth provided the ideas and the words, the philosophical foundation and the rhetorical power. Susan provided the organization and the persistence, the networks and the campaigns. They disagreed sometimes, particularly about the Woman's Bible, which Susan thought was a distraction from the suffrage fight. But they remained devoted friends and partners for 50 years. The women's rights movement that Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped create was part of a broader 19th century struggle for human rights and social justice. It was connected to the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, the labor movement, and other reform efforts. Elizabeth saw these connections clearly. She understood that injustice anywhere threatened justice everywhere, that the same assumptions about natural hierarchy that justified slavery also justified women's subordination. She believed in universal human rights, even if her practice sometimes fell short of her principles. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's writings remain powerful today. Her speeches and essays are models of clear thinking and persuasive argument. She had a gift for taking complex ideas and making them accessible, for using concrete examples and vivid language to illustrate abstract principles. She could be witty and sarcastic, tender and passionate, coolly logical and emotionally compelling. She wrote about women's daily experiences, about the frustrations of being treated as inferior, about the waste of women's talents and potential. She made the personal political long before that phrase was coined. Stanton's legacy is visible everywhere in modern America. Women vote, hold office, attend universities, work in every profession, control their own property, divorce abusive spouses, and claim authority over their own bodies and lives. These rights were not given freely. They were won through decades of organizing, speaking, writing, lobbying, and demonstrating. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was present at the creation of that movement. She provided its intellectual foundation and much of its moral force. She insisted that women were fully human and deserved to be treated as such. But the work Elizabeth Cady Stanton began is not finished. Women still face discrimination and violence. They are still underrepresented in positions of power. They still do most of the unpaid care work that makes society function. They still struggle to balance work and family in ways that men rarely have to. The wage gap persists. Reproductive rights are contested. The culture still sends messages about women's proper roles and limits. Elizabeth would recognize these problems. She would not be surprised that winning the vote did not solve everything. She always understood that legal equality was necessary but not sufficient, that changing laws was easier than changing minds and hearts. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was even in death a revolutionary figure. She had lived to see the movement she founded grow from a small gathering in a chapel in Seneca Falls to a nationwide crusade. She had seen women claim rights that had been unimaginable when she was young. She had contributed more than perhaps any other single person to changing ideas about women's nature and capabilities. She had insisted on women's full humanity at a time when that was a radical claim. She had refused to be patient, to wait for gradual change, to accept that women's rights should be subordinated to any other cause. She had been willing to be unpopular, to be ridiculed, to be denounced, because she believed in the justice of her cause. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a founder, a philosopher, a revolutionary, and the mother of the women's rights movement in America.